All right, hey everybody, I'm Jeffrey Rickman. This is Plain Spoken. On this podcast, I talk with lots of people, and usually they're in the Methodist sphere. I'm a global Methodist. We're the ones that split off from the progressive United Methodist Church. And we're at a place where we're trying to figure out who we are, how we're going to navigate the world. And last week, I reported on Wheaton College and what was going on. I'd found this tweet thread that I thought was really helpful from a guy named Joe Rigney. Had never heard of him before, but he had an excellent tweet thread. I think they call it an X thread. I don't know what you call it anymore. But he talked about the anatomy of a steer and how it is that institutions change. Of course, we Methodists, we started off with a great evangelical revival, very fervent, excellent doctrine. And in fact, today, a ton of great doctrine still remains in the United Methodist Church, but there was a drift. And what Dr. Rigney argues is that it's not just a drift, it's been steered, and that there are many institutions that have been very intentionally corrupted, and we need to know the signs of the times. Here's my thinking. I'm going to let Dr. Rigney speak for himself, but we need to know the signs of the times, and we need to see the way that Satan works to co-opt and corrupt things. And so he wrote this book, actually, that I'm going to have linked for you, The Sin of Empathy. It's being promoted by Canon Press. And I think it's really timely. Of course, a book cover and a title is not going to contain the fullness of the message. Here in this time, we're going to talk about what his particular concerns are, the anatomy of a steer, what he's lining out, and how empathy has been weaponized against the church. And so if that interests you, I would urge you to stick with me. I've already watched the Albert Mohler interview he did. We're going to go over some similar ground, but it's going to be different too. So I'm done talking. This is Dr. Rigney. Hey, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, why you care.
Yeah, so I'm currently a fellow of theology at New St. Andrews College. We're a small Christian liberal arts college in the chimney of Idaho, Moscow, Idaho. And I'm a pastor at Christ Church here as well. My main job is teaching freshman theology for our students, as well as some literature and things like that. But then I also write books sometimes and articles and various and sundry things like that. And one of the issues that I've worked on really over the last 7 or 8 years has been this way that empathy has been weaponized in order to steer institutions and churches and Christians. And it's not an idea that's original to me. I learned it from other people. I've tried to kind of sharpen it and flesh it out, but others have spoken to this as well. But I've tried to like amplify it and put my finger on a couple of different places where I see it happening. And there's a providential dimension. I've thought about sending the administration at Wheaton College a thank you letter because their decision to do what they did in relation to their alumni by withdrawing that congratulations for him was a really timely thing if you're writing a book about this phenomenon itself. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and I'm really glad to be talking to folks. I was a Baptist for most of my life. I've been a Presbyterian for the last few years. So to talk to some conservative the good kind of Methodist is always fun.
Well, it's a promising sign when any Reformed Calvinist is willing to allow for there being such a thing as a good Methodist. I know the caricatures you all have of us, and I'm currently engaged in the project of trying to reclaim some of those foundational doctrines like total depravity that we have in common. Yeah. And so it's a worthy thing, and I think we have a lot to learn from, I have been bemoaning for some time that we don't have any Methodists that I'm aware of that are publicly bucking the cultural trends that we're seeing in the world. Methodists for a long time, starting in the 19th century, kind of started walking hand in hand with the culture, just with the kind of slight corrective, and churches like yours have done a really fine job to be countercultural, to really push back, to be unafraid of the hatred of the world. And, I've been paying attention to Doug Wilson for a long time, and I don't think it's important to even say I don't agree about everything. I've really appreciated the public boldness that you guys have had and the Calvinist tradition more broadly has had, and I'm hoping that Methodists can be bold as well, but that means seeing the problem for what it is and how it works. So maybe we could talk about Wheaton for just a minute, because I haven't been real familiar with it. It's a strong evangelical college. There are some big names that have come out of it. But what's being alleged is that this recent development is the last in a long chain of compromises with the culture, where wokeism, leftism, progressivism, it's a beast with many names, has been creeping in. And this latest episode, and I don't know all the characters involved, but this Vought guy, who is an alumnus, got put in the Trump administration. They made a pretty salutary social media post, hey, congrats, he's an alumnus. But then students and alumni who lean left said, we can't have this, take it down now. And they did. They gave into it. And now there's a resulting petition from evangelical conservatives saying, we're going to stop funding you guys if you don't put an end to this. But you describe the mechanics, the different constituencies that get involved in the steer, and how it is that they facilitate this huge compromise. So maybe in an abbreviated fashion, you could kind of walk us through and help us see what that looks like.
Yeah, so start with kind of the general, what you might call the general environment that we find ourselves in. So I've got this current book coming out on the sin of empathy. The previous book is called Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, and in that book I drawing on the work of actually a Jewish rabbi from the 90s, talk about the fact that we live in an age of agitation and angst and anxiety. There's this kind of palpable sense that we're sitting on a powder keg. And everybody's kind of on edge. Everybody walks on eggshells. It's very reactive. And so start there. So start that we live in that kind of society, one that's driven by passions. The biblical term for it would be we're driven by our passions, anger and fear and desire and all of these passions. That's what the social media algorithm knows, that's what gets clicks. If they can make you fearful, if they can make you outraged or give you porn, that's what the social media thing is trying to do. So in that kind of environment, what that means is it's like there's gas fumes in the room, and all it takes is a spark to set it off. So in this case, the spark was this simple social media post from the Wheaton College media department. I assume may have been just some simple intern doing what they always do, congratulating alumni who have gotten into big positions. And in this case, Russ Vought he served in the first Trump administration as the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and had just been reconfirmed again. Interestingly, in his first confirmation hearing back in, I think, 2017 or whenever it would have been, he was actually attacked because of his affiliation with Wheaton, because Wheaton's a conservative evangelical institution, at least on paper. And so people said, they had fired a professor for being a non-Christian. And Vought defended them and said, this is what the Christians should be able to do that. Christian institutions should be able to fire their professors who don't hold to their statement of faith. And so he had defended his school, his alma mater. And then in this case, they congratulated him and said, hey, way to go. And we're praying for you. Very simple. No endorsement of his politics, no endorsement of the policies of the administration he serves, but simply a congratulations for an alumni who has done well with the education they received. But within less than 24 hours, and be quite frank, Wheaton's historically they've thought of themselves or put themselves forward as kind of aspiring to be the evangelical Harvard. They've got a long story. Billy Graham was involved there. John Piper is an alumni of Wheaton College. Jim Elliot, famously the martyr to the Auca Indians in Peru or Ecuador.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so Jim Elliot was one of their famous alumni. Carl Henry's been very involved. So mid 20th century evangelicalism, this was a hotbed of kind of the evangelical movement, and they've historically been very, very conservative. But over the last 22 years or so, we've seen some drift, and so I was actually pleasantly surprised that they were willing to congratulate their alumni, given that I suspected they don't share Trump's politics or in favor of all of his policies or something. But I thought, well, that's a good sign. They're not making a think about this. But within 24 hours, the social media mob had gone to work, right? That little spark was lit. And then you had sort of then there's these three groups. And this is the thing that over the last, say, 10 years or so, I've seen again and again in different institutions. And if you learn to see the signs, I think you can reasonably speculate that these three groups have been involved. The first group is what I call the victims. And I use that term sometimes because they're actual victims. They've really had bad things happen to them. But sometimes they're simply a victim class, a group
Hmm.
of people who are hurt and upset by some action. So in this case, this post was offensive to a group of people, and they said you know, what you're not thinking about all of the people who have been hurt by Trump's policies, by the immigrants who are being deported, by the people whose you know food has been cut off because he's cut U.S. aid funding and all this kind of stuff. That group of people is the first group, and they're objects of empathy. People hear about the hard things they're going through, and we soft-hearted Christians say, "Oh, we feel bad about that." The second group is the advocates and the activists. These are the folks who agitate and advocate on behalf of that first group, and they say, "Hey, we want to." We need to pursue justice. You've hurt these people and you need to make it right. So we want you to take down that post, or this is really disappointing. And they basically channel that angst and that emotion at the institution in question. And then there's the receivers of that, and I call these the respectables. They typically are nice guys. They aspire to be very winsome. They're very soft-hearted. And the big thing is they really don't like conflict. And so when something like this happens, all of that angst and agitation that's being directed at their institution really makes them uncomfortable, and they really want to do anything to make it go away. And so whatever looks to them like the quickest way to make it go away is the thing that they'll do. So in this case, what that meant was within 24 hours, they removed the congratulations and instead put up a little statement that basically said, hey, we normally would do this. We would congratulate our alumni. But in this case, there's a political situation, very vague terms. And so we don't want to be political. We're a nonprofit and we care about Christ and his kingdom. And so we're sorry. And they pulled it down. And the irony here is that in an effort to avoid being political, they politicized a very simple congratulations. It didn't have to be political. The agitators were certainly wanting to view it as political, and they were setting themselves up sort of as the interpreters of the meaning. This because you congratulated this man, it means that you have wholeheartedly endorsed everything the
Right.
Trump administration has ever done, and in fact, you probably endorsed everything that Trump himself has personally done. How dare you? And that was the meaning of a simple congratulations. And rather than saying, that's crazy, that's not what this means, we just simply said, way to go. And we're praying for, like, we're doing what the Bible says. We're going to pray for those who are in authority. No, we're going to adopt your framing. And so then we're going to react and try to appease. And so rather than holding their ground and simply saying this is a normal thing, they decide to appease these agitators, and as a result, they made it very political. And now they're in a situation where you have two, I think, substantial sized groups of alumni and I'm sure donors and friends of the college trying to pull you in one way or the other. And so you've got 1,000 people, alumni who've signed a petition rebuking them, as you said, and saying, hey, you pulled this down and we're not going to give you any more money until you make this right. And there's another group, the left side of that equation, that are also have a petition going, I believe, and they're saying, hey, this was a big mistake that you congratulated him at all, and we need you to stand firm and reject, Trump and all his ways. And so now they're caught in the middle of a political dogfight because rather than simply standing their ground, they decided to appease the mob.
Yeah, so we've got, and I can't help but see my own institution in this because I came out of the United Methodist Church, formed in 1968, and inherited the heritage of not just a reform movement, but a respectable 20th century movement that also had some societal critiques, some of which were worthy. And it doesn't matter. The main thing that matters is from 1968, we had this victim class you're talking about, is the gay folks. And year after year at General Conference, the victims would organize in big public displays of disobedience, and then there were activists. That we had all three classes, and we were motivated in particular by the respectables. As I reviewed your work, went through your thread here, I found myself most frustrated with the respectables because, to my mind, those are the ones that do the most damage, where they see this, they portray this as innocuous, as hey, we can compromise. Insofar as it's possible, we need to live at peace with all people. This is not the hill we need to die on. It's death by 1,000 cuts. And so we find ourselves in this position. Well, right now, my new denomination, we're just now getting established. And how is it that we are going to posture ourselves so as not to be vulnerable against wedge issues like this, not to have some issue. I mean, who knows what it's going to be? In this case, it was just a simple social media post. So if you're not vigilant, if you haven't maintained the right disposition, then you are going to be vulnerable to this kind of steer. And so, to my mind, my own tribe needs to be prepared for this, but it's not just my own tribe. All of us really need to be prepared for how do this feels like a spiritual battle to me. It feels like principalities and powers at work. So how is it that we can, and I've heard the concern on your end as well, we can't be reactive. And in some ways I identify as a conservative reactionary, but if they get you to just react against stuff, they can manipulate you. So what are the principles that we can sit upon that no matter what they throw at us, no matter what direction they come at, we can stand secure? So speak a little bit, I mean, it'd probably take hours, but what are some good guardrails, some good guidelines for an institution that is trying to guard against this kind of extreme hyperbolic, oh, you said something nice about this guy, you must totally agree with everything he's connected to. How do we do that? How do we defend?
Yeah. Yeah, so I just want to echo one thing you said there, which is that the respectables, the nice guys, are the biggest problem in this, and therefore have been the main target of my own work. I don't pretend to think that every agitator that you can somehow do away with that. That's it's like the poor. The woke you will always have with you, and so the issue is how are you able to endure and manage that? And so the way that respectables and the nice guys typically work is exactly what you said. They think that they're being peacemakers. They see division and they want it to go away, so they think they're being peacemakers, but they're actually being peacemongers. And the difference between a peacemaker and a peacemonger is that a peacemonger, it will do appeasement. Will basically figure out who's the most reactive and immature, who's making the biggest stink, and the main goal is to placate that group, and then to try to pull everybody else to conform to it. And this is one of the ways where empathy or compassion or pity or whatever word you want to use for it, which in and of itself is a good thing, it's a normal human thing, and when it's connected to Christ is a virtue, right? You want to weep with those who weep and be kind and tenderhearted. All of that's true. But this is how it gets hijacked, because rather than being sort of an overflow of an anchored in the love of God, anchored in the truth, we're going to show compassion to people, it becomes the driver and the lead, in which case it leverages power to the most reactive and immature members of a community. And so I think probably what you saw in your denomination was precisely that, is that people realize that the way to get your way around here is to be the loudest and to be the biggest victim. And if you were that, then everybody would accommodate you. And then the pressure would be leveraged by respectable, winsome people who on paper were conservative. I think this is what is so bewildering about it, is that they're the sort of people who, if you ask them, do you hold all of the right beliefs? The answer is yes. They can check all of the boxes on your doctrinal statement or your ethical covenants and things like that. But for whatever reason, they're accommodating all of this error and folly. And so they give cover to what looks like drift, but as I've been arguing, is actually being steered. It's not just a natural sort of, there's a current and you're floating along. There's someone who's trying to drive this show. And ultimately, I agree with you. I think that this is one of the devil's tactics. In a highly reactive and empathetic age, this is a great steering wheel to use. So then, like you said, how do you resist it? Well, the first thing I think leaders have to develop is a higher threshold for emotional pain. Right. Oftentimes, the first problem is that other people's distress makes us feel agitated as leaders. We don't like it, and so we seek the quick fix. We will do whatever we can to kind of make it go away. This was one of the arguments made by Edwin Friedman, I've drawn heavily on his work. He wrote a book in the 90s called A Failure of Nerve, leadership in the age of the quick fix, and I've drawn on him for some of my analysis, at least. And he argued that's what first thing you have to do is a higher tolerance for other people's distress. The biblical term for that, I've argued, is sober-mindedness. So when the Bible expects leaders to be sober-minded, if you break down, what does that mean? Well, sobriety, it's just the word sober-minded means not drunk. It's the
Yeah.
opposite of drunkenness. And so you think about that and you go, well, drunkenness is when having imbibed too much alcohol, your moral judgment's impaired, your physical reactions are impaired, your ethical judgment's impaired. So you've got these impairments as a result of imbibing too much alcohol. Well, the reality is that we can get drunk on more than just alcohol. You can get drunk on other people's passions. You can get drunk on your own emotions, right? So anger, we say things like this, right? I was blinded by anger. I was overcome by fear. Um, I was overwhelmed by pity. The grief was too much to bear. All of that kind of language is these are passions. And when they're raging, we don't see clearly and we don't act wisely. And so sober-mindedness, the expectation when the Bible makes that a requirement for, say, pastoral office, what it's expecting is you're the sort of person who, when emotions are hot, when they're running hot, you're not. You're cool. You're steady. You're calm. Now, how is that possible? Where did you get that ability? It seems like a superpower. Well, you're anchored in who God is. You have a stability of soul because you fear the Lord, not man. You're not channeling. You're able to absorb intense emotions from other people because you have some tethering and some anchoring in what God says and what he says about you. And therefore you're able to keep your head when everybody else is losing theirs. And so you have so the sober mindedness, clarity of mind, your judgment's not clouded by raging emotions, a stability of soul, you're not tossed to and fro by all of the chaos, and then a readiness to act. You're not, like you said, you're not reactive, but you are responsive. You're ready to kind of act wisely and prudently in really complicated situations because you're not being overpowered by your emotions or the emotions of others. So that's the fundamental virtue that I'm trying to commend for Christian leaders. Anchor yourself in the fear of the Lord, and then plant yourself on that rock, and then be ready to absorb it. Develop a higher threshold for this kind of distress.
Yeah. As you're talking about these things, I got, I don't like the therapeutic language, but for lack of a better term, I got like PTSD about, this distress that I felt watching this institution that had so much muscle that could have been used for God's glory, that was instead co-opted for leftist stuff. And, as you're talking through these concepts, there are other therapeutic terms that kind of map onto this when you're talking about someone who can keep their head when everybody's losing theirs. And at least in my pastoral circles, the term is a non-anxious presence.
Right.
And when we're talking about, but also, I mean, some of it correlates and some of it doesn't. When we're talking about people who have a high threshold or tolerance for other people's pain, the term that I think most people in my line of work would see that as is sociopathic, and that's not exactly what you're talking
Right.
about. We have these extremes that we can go to, and what you're arguing is we've been, as a society, at an extreme for a long time. We're like a ring in the nose of a bull. You can just lead us around with this toxic empathy, which has made our charity awful, which has made a lot of pastoral ministry quite awful and effete and ineffective. And what you're advocating is not running to the other extreme, but maintaining a balance between godly compassion for the least of these and not getting drunk on that, but having a moderation, almost a Christian realist approach to the world. Very practically speaking, right now we've got a new administration in the White House. We're looking at our new, old president, but a new vice president. A lot of stuff I see from him in particular encourages me because he bears some of these features you're talking about, being level-headed, not being afraid to say the quiet part out loud, but saying it in a way that's no more inflammatory than need be. I'm really impressed with what I see, but the challenge is incumbent upon us. We kind of fell into J.D. Vance. I think we need a much more intentional way of applying a litmus test to potential leaders as to how it is that we see their Christian virtue being exercised. My concern about leadership in the church in particular is that they're conflict-avoidant people. Now, I hate conflict, but I'm also aware that leadership requires me to be in conflict, and I'm probably not pure in my spirit as I deal with it. But what is a good way to figure out if a potential leader has a healthy balance here, a sober-minded approach to dealing with other people's emotions such that they can navigate these crisis situations well?
Yeah, good. So, man, a couple of different things in there. So, that language actually you used of a non-anxious presence, actually, I think maybe originated from Edwin Friedman. So his definition of a
Mm.
leader was a well-differentiated person with a non-anxious presence, and which rolls off the tongue. And but one of my basically a part of my project has been to translate that into more recognizably biblical language. So that's a really good concept, but sober-mindedness would be the biblical kind of analog to that. So I think that's absolutely right. The other thing that strikes me is when it comes to cultivating this or identifying it in other people. Um, Basically, the most actionable kind of advice or counsel I give in my book on emotional sabotage is learn to pay attention to your reluctances, your hesitations, your snap reactions. So in any kind of setting, you're in a fraught elders meeting or denominational meeting or whatever you have, and there's something that you think I might say this, and immediately it catches in your throat, and you go, "Ooh, I'm not going to say that." Analyze that, like or another way to put it is in certain kind of situations we find ourselves, we're very adept at this. Human beings are really remarkable in this way at kind of avoiding, like you said, conflict avoidance. We know that, oh, I'm not going to step there, and I'm going to just kind of sidestep that. Leaders become very adept at this, and we typically we call it wisdom, right? We say this is wisdom, but is it wisdom or is it cowardice? Is it cowardice
Hmm.
masquerading as wisdom?
Right.
This isn't the right context. And and so learning to recognize when you're doing that and asking yourself, interrogating it. Why did I do that?
Hmm.
One of the tests that I often give. We have I've taught seminaries at a seminary in Minnesota a number of years, and we've just started a seminary here. So when I'm talking to ministers in training, or I'm talking to doing pastoral conferences, things like that, I'll ask them. I say, ask yourself this question. Say this Sunday you had to preach. You were asked to preach for your church on marriage, but you had a choice of one of two texts to be your main text. The first one is Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church.
Hmm.
The second is 1 Peter 3. Wives, submit to your husbands like Sarah did, calling him Lord.
Mm.
Which passage do you want to preach on? And almost universally, I've never yet found somebody who doesn't flinch, who doesn't immediately have an awareness of, oh, I know which one I want. I know of those two, I know which sermon I want to preach and which
Yeah.
sermon I don't.
Right.
And that right there is telling you something. It's telling you that you have an implicit awareness of where the trouble spots are in your congregation.
Mm.
You know which sermon you would probably be able to preach straight down the middle and just say what the Bible says.
Hmm.
Husbands, Jesus died for his bride. He sacrificed and gave himself up for her, and that's what you're called to do. And we preach it straight down the middle. All of a sudden, you move over to the flip side of that, and all of a sudden, there's well, we need to have some nuance. We need to bury. Yes, it says this, but here's what it doesn't mean. And you spend most of the sermon telling your people what the passage doesn't mean. It doesn't
Mm.
mean that if your husband's abusing you that you have to go along with it. It doesn't mean if he wants you to sin you have to go along with it. It doesn't mean. It doesn't mean. It doesn't mean. But you never actually get to what does it mean?
Hmm.
What does God wanting wives to do in these circumstances? Um, we bury the plain meaning of the text under acres of qualifications. Why do we do that? Because we're aware of the reaction that we're likely to get, and we're trying
Hmm.
to head it off. Now, so that's identifying the problem. Now the question is, what do you do? Well, you have to ask, well, what would faithfulness mean here? If I'm tempted in this moment to avoid saying certain things that might offend, say, the women in my congregation, am I faithfully shepherding them, or am I coddling their temptations?
Hmm.
That's the sort of question you have to ask. That doesn't mean that you don't make the qualifications in the sermon. It's perfectly fine to do that. But are you also laboring to be as clear as possible about what God is requiring of them? Or are you trying to avoid that lest you get some angry emails, lest the women's ministry team send you, want to have a meeting with you because certain people were offended? If you're trying to avoid that, then you're probably in a situation where you're being steered, and you're being and it's on you. Like in the end of the day, you're not gonna, if at the end of the day, if your church then begins to drift into, say, feminism or worse, um and then God shows up one day and says, hey, what gives? How'd your church end up here? You don't get to say, well, the women you gave me. It was on you. You were the leader, you were the pastor. that's why you were there. You were put there precisely to shepherd in these circumstances. So one of the situations that I always use to illustrate this is the situation in Antioch in the book of Galatians. It's a really profound. If you analyze it kind of from the social dynamics perspective and then see how the gospel is working its way there, it's really interesting because Peter's eating with the Gentiles. It's all good, one people. Then certain men come from James with a message. And we have to do a little speculating here, but what seems likely is happening is the church in Jerusalem is being persecuted by unbelieving Jews. We see that in the book of Acts. And there's certain the circumcision group, these Jews have heard that the Christians are eating with Gentiles. They're not keeping kosher. They're not doing what the law says. And so that's what's bringing the pressure on the church in Jerusalem. And James sends messengers to Peter saying, hey, man, it's really heavy here. It's fraught, it's tense, it's a little bit of a powder keg. And people are hearing that you're one of our leaders and that you're just treating Gentiles like they're in. So I know that, I know what God said and everything, but maybe you could just back off for a little bit, like until things cool down. You know what I'm saying? Just a little compromise. And Peter goes along with it. And it says he did so fearing the circumcision parties. Like there was a fear of what these unbelievers, I think, would do to the church. And so out of fear, he withdraws. And because he withdraws as the leader, the rest of the Jews, including Barnabas, follow him in that hypocrisy. So you can see the kind of cascade effect of like, oh, this group over here influences this group over here, influences this group over here, until it finally reaches the leader. And the leader has to decide, am I going to stand firm or am I going to buckle? In that case, Peter buckled. But Paul didn't. And so now you can actually see a second layer of the where the angst would come. Imagine Paul on his way to Antioch talking to his companion saying, well, I heard that Peter did this thing and I think I got to go get in his face about it. Well, Paul, don't do that, right? Maybe have a conversation with him, a side conversation. And Paul says, no, he did this publicly. I got to confront it publicly.
Yeah.
I got to stand up and confront him. And no, Paul, and you can just imagine the palpable angst in that room as the two apostles have a showdown. And Paul just comes and he's clear. He's not reactive. He's not angry. He's going to try to bring clarity to the situation. All of these angsty things this fear and this hypocrisy and these pressures that have led to this separation, Paul's just going to cut right through it with a couple of simple questions. Peter, how did you get saved? Did you get saved by works of the law? Were you justified by works? Or were you justified by faith? They were justified by faith too. There's one people. There's not two people. There's one people. Isn't that what you believe, Peter? And he just cuts right through it to bring clarity to what the gospel requires. That's the kind of leadership that God calls us to have. Is not, we're not angry. We're not losing our head. Instead, we're going to bring clarity and we're going to bring kind of sublimated conflict, that kind of like under the table conflict that's steering everybody. We want to bring it out on the table so that we can all actually decide, what does God want us to do? What does he require of us? Here's the real question. And that's really uncomfortable for people. There's a lot of people who just want to avoid that at all costs. And leaders have to be the one to say, I'm going to go for it.
I'm going to spend some time exercising some empathy, sort of. Well, steel manning the other side, yeah. Because great. We both know what they will say, which is we're called to do ministry to the least of these. We're called to be mindful of how our words impact other people. We're supposed to speak with truth, yes, but also grace. And that means that we, like Jesus, have to have a care for these sheep and never put us. In fact, he has a special curse for those who put a stumbling block in front of the least of these. So the way that we do that is, we've got our intersectional scale here, and women are below men, and you're a man speaking, so you need to condescend and take special care not to injure them. And men sit on the top of that intersectional scale. You don't need to take that special care. In fact, they need to be beaten down a little bit. So your role as pastor, my role as pastor, is to operate around these realities of intersectionality, lifting up those who are oppressed, putting down those who are on top. And in so doing, that's what creates the beloved community. But as we look at that, what I'm appreciating about you is you're saying these are fundamental biblical concepts. And yes, we have compassion. You know, the title of your book does not sum up what you actually think. You think that there is room for compassion, empathy, whatever, but it needs to be held in balance with sober-mindedness. And what you see when you actually look at Jesus, you know, I anticipate a lot of people would hear your example with Paul and be like, well, yeah, but Paul was a weirdo. Like, we can't all be Paul. Okay, let's talk about Jesus. All right, now, Paul, you shouldn't dismiss Paul, but let's talk about Jesus, because yes, he was compassionate, but also what did compassion look like from him? Syrophoenician woman comes asking for help. He says, it's not right to give what belongs to the children to dogs. He's calling her a dog, okay? This is offensive. This is not good for her self-esteem. You want to talk about patriarchy. Oh man, things were so much different back then in that direction. And yet his concern doesn't seem to be, this is a delicate flower of a person that I need to operate around. It's rather, I'm going to speak the truth in love to this woman, and look what happens whenever she perseveres. Whenever he is contending with people, he doesn't back off and try and persuade them. He says, you're children of the devil. You're not going to agree with me. This is something that's really hard for us to understand, because we have been so inculcated from the earliest days of Sunday school. To be Christian is to be nice, to be considerate of other people's feelings, and to imagine being a person, you know, as you describe Paul right now, he's saying the quiet part out loud. I think that that's a helpful phrase right there, is you have this latent anxiety around the room that we're supposed to operate around. He's saying, no, I'm not going to operate around it. Here's what it is. Let's deal with it for what it is. When you have that peace in Christ, then you can offer that to other people. And in fact, that should be expected in Christian environments. And so what I hear you talking about is we need to have a sensitivity to that, first and foremost in us. Am I being conflict avoidant? But also when I see that in me, do I notice it in other people who, hey, there seems to be something going on under the surface here, but they're acting like it's not. I feel like we're dancing right here. I feel like, I call it CEO speak, but where it's just all good feelings and there's a lot to be, and we don't need to talk about this negative stuff. I find myself really trusting a lot more people who say, here's the anxiety that I know you all carry. Here's the resentment that I know is in this room. Here's the way that I think we should go, and I want you to be on board with me. The problem is, I don't know that we have a whole lot of leaders like that, and I don't know how to communicate in a helpful way. This is the kind of leadership that I want to see. So if you could respond to that, and then I want to kind of pivot in the direction of our current political leadership as well, because we also have on the other side, like these, I don't know what they'd be called, groypers, like people who intentionally like trigger others and make things worse. How do we find that middle line where we're not too extreme? And go ahead in whatever direction you want.
Yeah, so I do think you're right you know, the ability to sort of name the elephant in the room is a big part of what's needed, right? And oftentimes we try to avoid talking about the elephant in the room. That's the way that phrase works. We walk on eggshells in order to avoid it. I do think the other thing is when it comes to that intersectional framework that you mentioned, the truth in that is that women are the weaker vessel. The Bible says that, and that husbands should therefore live with their wives in an understanding way. And so there should be this element of like, what does it look like? And so you do treat women differently than you treat men. There is a kind of directness of speech that you might give to a man that wouldn't be appropriate to a woman. And I think so. That's the truth in it. The challenge comes is that Peter and Paul and Jesus were all living in a day that had the exact same, had not even stronger sort of asymmetries of men versus women. And Paul still said, wives, submit to your husbands. Peter still said, wives, submit to your husbands. So the fact that that there was that asymmetry didn't remove God's responsibility. What does God want women to do? How does he want them to operate? I think the other element that comes into play is having the fortitude to sort of set when you say the thing that you know is going to set people off, you know, then you see this over and over again with Paul and Jesus going into a situation and going, I'm going to say something true, and it's going to probably cause an eruption, right? Everywhere Paul went, there was a riot. But you have to have the fortitude to keep your head and endure it. It's not something to be avoided, it's something to be endured. And I think that's a mindset shift that leaders really have to cultivate is if your first goal is avoid all conflict, you won't be successful. Okay, you can't in this world. And the second thing is that what you're choosing is often prolonged chronic pain, like low, just achy stuff, because there's always this angst there, as opposed to acute pain that might be sharp for a moment, but that will actually bring relief. And this is the thing that humans are very prone to. If given the choice between a sharp acute pain, temporary, and long-term chronic pain, our default is often we'll choose long-term chronic pain. So that's the thing that leaders have to make a mindset shift. And then maybe the last thing I think about is when we think about caring for the least of these, there's a reason that Jesus warned us that false prophets would arise and would be wolves in sheep's clothing. The idea that wolves would masquerade as vulnerable sheep is one that Jesus explicitly warns us about. This is the thing that will happen. And so the fact that someone presents as a wounded sheep does not necessarily mean that they are. And part of what leaders have to do is be able to discern, is this actually a confused sheep? And therefore I need to shepherd them in a particular way. Or is this a wolf masquerading as a sheep in order to infiltrate and harm my flock? And shepherds are called to fight wolves, including the ones who present that way. And I think especially in a civilization that has been so impacted by the gospel, in which Christianity has woven its way down into the foundations, it's no surprise that the devil's strategy would be to take some of the most potent elements of Christianity, the compassion that Christ offers us and commands of us, and corrupt it. One of the things I've learned from C.S. Lewis, his book, The Four Loves, is a fantastic treatment of this, is that natural loves, lower loves, when they become untethered from divine love, become demonic. And he illustrates that with family affection, right? The love of a mother for a child, if it's not tethered to divine love, becomes possessive and tyrannical. Friendship, if that's a great and glorious love, but if it's not tethered to divine love, guess what happens? It becomes cliquishness, inner ring, exclusionary. Erotic love, romantic love, if it's not tethered, it becomes devouring, right? And will break all bonds of covenant in pursuit of fulfillment. And so these natural loves, because they're so good, become really, really demonic realities when they become God. So in this case, what I'm arguing in the new book is that compassion, love for the hurting, care for the hurting, is a great and glorious good, which means when it goes wrong, when it becomes disconnected from what's true and what's good, when it becomes disconnected from what God says, it becomes a really potent demon. It becomes really, really destructive. And that's what we mean by toxic empathy, weaponized empathy, untethered empathy. You choose whatever word you want to call it. But it's that reality in which people learn that they can manipulate others, emotionally blackmail them by their pity. This is something that, again, I learned a lot of this from C.S. Lewis. And in his novel, Great Divorce, he depicts a situation in which someone has to say, look, stop using other people's pity the wrong way. Pity is supposed to be a spur. It's supposed to prompt those who are healthy, those who are joyful, to help those who are in misery. That's what pity's for. It's a spur. Go help them. But it can be used the wrong way around as a form of emotional blackmail. You can hold the world hostage by pity. And I think that what we've seen is in the last 10, 15 years, especially, maybe in the Methodist world, it's been going on a lot longer than that. But a concerted effort to weaponize other people's pity in order to get their way. And it's that sort of thing that wise, faithful pastors have to learn to resist. And it's not easy, and you're going to be called names. And maybe that's the last thing on this that's important is Christians have to learn that when Jesus said they're going to call you all sorts of false things on my account, he meant it. They're going to lie about you. If you do what I'm saying, if you remain faithful at your post and you resist the manipulation around you, you are going to be called the most horrific things possible. And what you should do on the front side is you should ask yourself, what is the worst thing they could call me? Like when I think about the names, the reputation that someone could try to give me, what would it be? Would it be if they call me a misogynist? Is that it? Homophobic? A racist? Is it you're MAGA? You're a red hat? Is it what is it? you're an abuser. You're an abuse enabler. What are the worst things they could call you? When you figure out what that is, I will guarantee you, if you are faithful, they are going to call you that thing because that label becomes a steering wheel. We don't want to be called bad names. And so we will go through great efforts. We will jump through hoops in order to get people to not call us these names that we don't want. In contrast, Jesus tells us, look, blessed are you when they call you those names. When they persecute you and they utter falsehoods about you, you're blessed. You're in great company. That's what they did to the prophets. That's what they did to him. They called him a drunkard, a glutton, and a blasphemer. What a great reputation Jesus had, right? And so be ready for that and go, I'm not, my two principles there are one, be willing, in fact, even welcome and rejoice when you're slandered like that. And then the second principle is make sure the slander is false, right? Don't be, so this is to your thing about the guys who maybe lean into it in the wrong way and they say, look, they're going to call us names. We might as well become that evil thing, but don't become the evil thing that your enemies are accusing you of, right? Be faithful, be compassionate, be righteous, all of those things, be them, but be willing to be called the opposite. That's what Jesus, that's what Paul, that's what the prophets, all of them had to endure that reality.
Yeah, I'm thinking of our current government leadership, and they get called all kinds of things, and then it seems to me that what's incumbent right now, and what I'm actually pretty happy with, I'm on X quite a bit, and I feel like we are scrutinizing each thing and saying, no, this is adult responsible leadership, or no, this is really short-sighted. I really appreciate so many of the people that were blowing Trump's horn last week are saying, hey, this IVF thing, no, this is not good.
Yeah,
This is
right.
poor judgment. And to, rather than have this partisan, this is my team, this is your team, I hate everything they do, I love everything, just having discernment and going, okay, well, these are my principles and this is how I navigate the world. But okay, let's apply this in the moment. Right now, I see a lot of pushback against the rhetoric around bringing this thing between Russia and Ukraine to an end. Openness on the White House to say a lot of this is Ukraine's fault. They started this war in a number of ways. We need to bring it to an end. It's not good for anybody. And then you have what feels to me like virtue signaling from a lot of people going, the Ukrainians have suffered so much. They did nothing to bring this on themselves. They've been perfect victims. We need to side against Russia. And how much of that particular situation reflects these larger phenomena you're talking about where we've been manipulated from empathy?
Yeah, I think that not being an expert at all on global politics, for sure. But in terms of the dynamics, I think what you see is the administration from the best, the steelman version of what they're doing is recognizing Ukraine's losing. Europe ought to be the one stepping in to help them. If it's in Europe's backyard, this is their problem. And yet, over the last 50 or so years, Europe has decided we don't need armies, we don't need militaries, we just need lots and lots of health benefits. And so we're going to take all of them, and we're just going to rely on the American military to be the global police. And the Trump administration is saying that's not going to work anymore. If this is your problem, this is your backyard, you guys need to step up to the plate and do that. And then I think the other recognition that they seem to be making is Russia, China. There's a lot of different places around the world that are hotbeds, and right now it's not feasible for the United States to get into a shooting war, a deep shooting war with Russia in Ukraine, because it would make us vulnerable in a whole other places. So there's a kind of like recognition of the facts on the ground and a coming to grip with the reality of the situation, as opposed to a kind of more idealistic fancy. And so that would be the way I think analyze what they're doing. Then in contrast to that, I think that the idealists are saying, but we just have to anyway. And then this is where you get the Ukraine's the victim, and so we have to act on behalf of the victims, always and everywhere. And if we do that, it's going to be again death by 1,000 pinpricks. Like we will bleed ourselves dry that way. And so there's a real kind of like realpolitik, I think, that the Trump administration seems to be demonstrating. The guys that I listen to that know this better than I do, that's their take. And I want to be humble enough to go, I don't know the big picture of what's the right call. but that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think you can see these sort of like um, I think the other places that you see in the current political moment with immigration, I think we're going to continue to, the more if the Trump administration does continue to ramp up deportations, I think we're going to see more and more stories, very sad stories of illegal immigrants who are here and now they've been kicked out and their families have been separated because somebody was legal and somebody wasn't, and so all of that kind of thing. I think you'll see lots of those as a way to kind of kneecap those efforts. I think the same thing will be true with any government cuts. They will, right now, you see this, the phrase that people are throwing around is malicious compliance, in which, hey, we need you to cut this much money. And then the government agencies decide we're going to pick the place that's going to be most painful to the public. They have discretion about what to cut, but we're going to cut something that means, no, you can't go to Yosemite National Park anymore. And so they're technically complying, but what are they trying to do? Maximize pain for the public. Why? Because pain for the public will mean empathy, will mean compassion. Hey, we got to stop this. We got to stop this. Or you see what you see a lot. I've seen a number of stories now about all these federal workers who were fired and all of the news reports that are going through the federal workforce and saying people talking about how, I don't know how our family's going to make it, and all of these really, really heartbreaking stories. And you look at that and you go, where were those stories whenever they shut down the nation for COVID? And all sorts of families were suffering because the government said you can't have a business be open. Where was
How
that
about people
when
dying alone in the hospital because you couldn't be? Yeah, there was. Yeah,
exactly, like where were the news did not take that, they didn't showcase those stories. Why not? And the reason is because empathy is often very selective. This is one of the reasons why it's a dangerous emotion, is that it acts like a spotlight and it becomes myopic. And so empathy for certain groups, but not others. So even, earlier, I think whenever you were steel manning, which I think you did a great job steel manning the argument for the other side on why compassion for the least of these, when most people hear that phrase, they heard that in that least of these, they heard minorities, they heard women, they heard gays, lesbians, they heard those classes of people. How many people, when you said least of these, thought rural white working class with a red hat? Was that least of these? Should we care about what they think? Should their concerns matter to us? And nobody does, because progressives have successfully identified the worthy objects of compassion, the worthy victims, the victims who you ought to care about, and the ones that you can safely ignore because they're actually part of the problem. Oh, they're white, they don't count. And so this is one of the ways that the framing itself, once you step back and realize like, oh, all of my frames for what compassion means are defined by progressives. They are telling me who I should be compassionate toward and who I don't have to be compassionate for. I can actually totally dismiss their concerns. And that's when you realize, hey, it's not the Bible that's shaping our notions of compassion, it's the world. And instead, what I'm commending is a more tethered compassion to what God has said, anchor it there, and then be compassionate all over the place. Every place that you can be, whatever God puts in front of you. Yeah, show the compassion, but make sure it's anchored to the word.
friends, I'm reaching the time with Dr. Rigney here. I obviously think it's a worthy topic. I really hope you'll engage it. Obviously, he's got a book right now that you can buy, once again, called The Sin of Empathy. You might consider getting it. But meditate on these things. What I'm glad we did right here at the end was show how this is something that impacts not just the church, but really every sector of public life. And it's not even just in America. This is something that has been weaponized and utilized throughout the world. And there's a lot that we aren't in control of. But in our sphere, where we are, we can insist on the standards of righteousness. And I think I speak with both Dr. Rigney and for myself as well. We don't want to go too far to this extreme of my way or the highway, nobody matters. We want a balance between a biblical ethos of compassion and a sober-minded, realistic way of going through the world. Until Christ comes again in glory, that's what I think we should be fighting for. So with that in mind, I'm going to invite Dr. Rigney to pray for us, and any last words you want to have, and go ahead.
Yeah, good. Well, let me just pray for your audience. Father, I'm grateful for Jeff, and I'm grateful for the Global Methodist Church, and I pray that you would multiply your mercy to them, help them to remain faithful where you've planted them. Let sober-mindedness begin, faithful sober-mindedness begin in homes, with husbands leading their homes and wives being sober-minded and raising children, and then work its way out into our congregations and our denominations and into the wider communities and world. So Lord, start with us, help us to be faithful where you've planted us, and we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Dr. Rigney, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.